Donald Trump intends to disengage from its decades-long commitment to Europe, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. Not a rumor, not a think tank fantasy, a working policy framework that has been circulated at senior levels inside the current administration. And the moment word of its existence began leaking out of Washington, the reaction in Brussels was not anger. It was not defiance. It was something far more alarming. It was silence. The kind of silence that falls over a room when someone realizes the worst thing they ever imagined might actually be true. Europe has spent years telling itself that no American president would ever really walk away, that the alliance was too deep, too old, too embedded in mutual interest to ever actually fracture. Tonight, that assumption is in pieces on the floor. And what comes next will reshape the world your children inherit. Let's start with what we actually know about this document and how it became public, because the how matters just as much as the what. According to multiple sources familiar with its contents, the framework did not come from a rogue staffer or a disgruntled bureaucrat. It came from a structured internal policy review commissioned at the highest levels of the Trump administration, a review designed to answer one specific question: what would a deliberate, managed American exit from its European commitments actually look like, and how fast could it be executed? The document is reported to be structured in 3 phases. The first phase, which sources say is already underway, involves reducing American financial contributions to joint European defense structures, scaling back rotational military deployments, and deliberately slowing the pace of intelligence sharing with key NATO partners. The second phase, which has not yet begun but is described as ready for activation, involves formal renegotiation of the terms under which American forces are stationed on European soil, with the explicit goal of either extracting significantly higher host nation payments or withdrawing those forces entirely. The third phase, the one that has sent a chill through every foreign ministry in Europe, involves a comprehensive diplomatic repositioning in which the United States no longer treats the European Union as a privileged partner, but instead engages with European nations purely on a transactional bilateral basis, bypassing EU institutions entirely. That third phase is not just a military story. It is a demolition order for the entire post-war framework of Atlantic relations, and Brussels knows it. To understand why this plan was written, you have to understand how the Trump administration actually thinks about Europe, because it is fundamentally different from how every previous American administration, Republican or Democrat, has thought about it. For the Trump circle, Europe is not an ally in the traditional sense. It is not a partner bound by shared values, shared history, or shared sacrifice. It is, in their framework, a collection of wealthy nations that have spent 80 years exploiting American military protection to build generous welfare states and aggressive trade policies that they have then used to undercut American economic interests. That is the worldview. And from that worldview, the entire architecture of the transatlantic relationship looks not like a strategic asset, but like a subsidy, a massive, expensive, open-ended subsidy that the American taxpayer has been funding for generations, while European governments lecture Washington on democracy and human rights. Whether that analysis is fair is a separate debate. What matters right now is that this is the operating framework behind the leaked plan. And that framework has a clear, logical conclusion. If Europe is a free rider, the solution is to stop giving the ride. The plan that has been leaked is not the product of frustration or impulsiveness. It is the product of a coherent, if deeply controversial, strategic philosophy that has been building inside the American right for decades and has now, for the first time, found a president willing to execute it. Now let's talk about Brussels, because the exposure the title references is real, and it is severe. The European Union's entire foreign and security policy is built on a set of assumptions that the leaked plan directly destroys. The first assumption is that the United States will always be there as the ultimate guarantor of European security. The second is that the transatlantic relationship is governed by shared institutions and shared rules that no single leader can unilaterally dismantle. The third, and perhaps the most dangerous one to lose, is that even when American presidents are difficult, even when they threaten and demand and complain, the fundamental architecture of the relationship is too deeply embedded to actually collapse. All three of those assumptions are now in question, and Brussels is exposed because it has spent years knowing they were assumptions, knowing that European defense spending was inadequate, knowing that strategic autonomy was more slogan than reality, knowing that the continent's security ultimately depended on a country whose voters had no voice in European decisions and no guaranteed loyalty to European interests. They knew this. They talked about it in corridors and conferences, and then they went back to their offices and did not fix it, because fixing it was expensive, politically painful, and always felt like a problem for another day. That day has arrived. The European Commission is now in a position of extraordinary weakness. It cannot match American military capability in any realistic time frame. It cannot replace American intelligence assets. It cannot substitute American diplomatic weight in global institutions. And it cannot, this is the part that stings most, tell its own member states what to do. Because defense policy in the EU remains the sovereign domain of individual governments. So at the exact moment when Europe needs unified, decisive action, it is structurally prevented from taking it. The reaction among EU member states is not uniform, and that division is itself a critical part of the story. Poland and the Baltic states are in a category of alarm that goes beyond anything seen in post-Cold War European politics. These are countries that share borders with Russia or Russian-aligned Belarus. Their security calculations are not abstract. They are not about trade balances or diplomatic prestige. They are about whether Russian tanks stop at their borders. For these nations, the leaked American exit plan is not a policy disagreement. It is an existential threat. Polish officials have already reached out directly to the Trump administration, not through EU channels, not through NATO's formal structures, but bilaterally, government to government, to determine whether Poland's specific defense relationship with the United States is still intact, or whether it too is subject to the new framework. Germany's reaction has been more measured in public, more panicked in private. Berlin has for decades been the central pillar of European economic power, but it has deliberately kept its military capability limited, partly due to historical guilt, and partly due to the genuine belief that American security guarantees made large-scale German rearmament unnecessary. That calculation is now being forcibly revised. German defense officials who have spent years resisting domestic pressure to increase military spending are now the ones pushing hardest for acceleration. What was a slow, grudging movement toward the NATO 2% spending target has become, almost overnight, a race toward something much larger. France, predictably, has responded with the most visible political energy. Macron has been publicly composed but privately furious, not just at Washington, but at the European partners who dismissed his warnings about strategic autonomy for years. In closed-door meetings, French officials have reportedly been using language about the American exit plan that is not diplomatic. They are treating it as a betrayal, and they are using it to push aggressively for a European defense structure that Paris would inevitably lead. This is a crisis, but France intends to ensure it does not go to waste. There is a part of this story that almost nobody is discussing publicly, and it may be the most immediately dangerous element of what is being described in the leaked plan. Intelligence. The United States does not just protect Europe with troops and nuclear weapons. It protects Europe with information. American signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, cyber capabilities, and threat assessment networks are deeply woven into the daily operational security of every NATO member. European military and intelligence agencies do not just cooperate with American intelligence. In many cases, they depend on it in ways that cannot be quickly or easily replaced. The leaked plan, according to sources, includes provisions for a deliberate reduction in intelligence sharing with European partners who are deemed to be uncooperative with American economic or political demands. This is not a future scenario, Reduced intelligence sharing has already been documented in specific contexts over the past several months, and the implications of that reduction are immediate and serious. European security agencies that lose access to American signals intelligence are flying partially blind. They will not know what they do not know, which is the most dangerous form of vulnerability there is. A terrorist network, a Russian intelligence operation, a hybrid attack on European infrastructure. Any of these threats becomes harder to detect and harder to counter when the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world starts looking the other way. It is tempting to describe what the Trump administration is doing as reckless or self-destructive, but to understand it properly, you have to take its internal logic seriously. From Trump's perspective, and from the perspective of the advisors driving this plan, the exit from Europe is not abandonment. It is leverage. The theory is that Europe will not take its own defense seriously, will not spend what it needs to spend, and will not treat the United States as an equal partner in trade and diplomatic terms, unless it faces a genuine, credible threat of American withdrawal. Previous presidents threatened. Trump is executing. And the belief inside his administration is that once Europe truly believes the guarantee is gone, the behavior will change fast. There is historical precedent for this kind of coercive pressure producing results. Trump's first term demands on NATO spending did contribute to increases in European defense budgets. The threat of tariffs has repeatedly moved European governments toward negotiating positions they previously refused to adopt. The logic of maximum pressure from Trump's worldview has a track record. What is different this time is the scale of what is being threatened, and the question of whether the thing being used as leverage can survive being treated as leverage. NATO is not a trade deal. It is a military alliance with integrated command structures, decades of institutional memory, and a deterrence architecture that depends on absolute credibility. The moment it becomes a bargaining chip, some of that credibility evaporates permanently, regardless of whether a deal is eventually reached. The next 3 months are going to determine whether this plan remains a framework or becomes a reality, and several specific events will serve as the critical decision points. NATO foreign ministers are scheduled to meet, and the question of what American representatives say and what they refuse to say about the alliance's mutual defense commitments will be watched with a level of intensity that has no recent precedent. Any ambiguity in the American position will be read by Moscow as opportunity and by Eastern European capitals as catastrophe. Simultaneously, the EU is scrambling to accelerate defense cooperation agreements among member states, bypassing the slow institutional processes that normally govern European security decisions. Emergency funding mechanisms for European defense are being drafted. Conversations about a joint European nuclear deterrent, a topic that was virtually unspeakable in mainstream European politics a year ago, are now being had openly in policy journals and more quietly in government offices. France, as the only EU nuclear power, is at the center of those conversations. What Paris asks in return for extending its nuclear umbrella over Europe will reshape the continent's political balance of power for a generation. And in Washington, the plan's existence as a leak is itself now a political event. Congressional figures from both parties who oppose a fundamental break with NATO are mobilizing. Legal constraints on the president's ability to unilaterally withdraw from NATO commitments remain contested and may become the subject of formal legislative action. The internal battle inside the American government over this plan is not over. It may, in fact, be just beginning. Pull back from all of it: the documents, the meetings, the emergency calls, the leaked frameworks, the panicked capitals, and look at what this moment actually is. This is the moment the world built after 1945 begins to be unmade. The institutions, the alliances, the guarantees, the assumptions that have kept major war out of Europe for 80 years are being renegotiated, not at a peace conference, not in the open light of democratic deliberation, but through leaked plans and administrative maneuvers and the deliberate, calculated dismantling of trust that took generations to build. What fills the space left behind is not yet decided. That is both the danger and the reason why your attention to this story right now, in this moment, matters more than it ever has. The plan is on the table, the clock is running, and the world you wake up in 6 months from now will be determined by decisions that are being made today. Stay locked in, because the next leak might be the one that changes everything.